One of the things you mentioned, Stephen, in your experience of beginning to look at Anglicanism was the idea of the monoepiscopate or the monoepiscopate. I've heard it said both ways. I'm not sure which is correct, but the idea that the early church wasn't these disparate kind of groups of believers, but there was an authority structure that looks very Catholic that was established very, very early on. And this for me was an experience. When I began to read the Church Fathers, I got the $4 Ante-Nicene collection off Amazon.
Nice.
For my Kindle, and I couldn't believe what $4 got me. It was this trillions of pages. That was just the Ante-Nicene Fathers, and I began to just read it. And I went, wait a second, like, where is my bishop? Why don't I have one anymore? And how can somebody so early on say you need to cleave to your bishop and that's where you'll find the church? I kind of went, what the? This is a family podcast, but I was awestruck to read that, and then the logic becomes, well, where did my bishop go? Why did that system stop being that system? Mm-hmm. You became Anglican to solve that kind of problem, but then realized that that's not really tenable. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's important, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. If this thing existed in the early church, this system that we can see, it looks like Christ and the apostles established from a very early time frame. Never mind other things like the Eucharist and the Mass and baptism. These things, this is pretty central. Where did it go, and why did it go away?
Well, that's one of the great shockers when somebody goes to the Church Fathers, actually, is to see. So when you're in Protestantism, they'll talk a lot about the spiritual church, right? You don't really know who's really in the church. You don't know what the church is. The fleshliness and the tangibleness of the church, according to the Church Fathers, is a shock to you. Yeah. And it is quite unique for the history of any religion to be that structured that early and to be that in communication with one another that early. Yeah. I mean, Christianity started a whole new genre of letter writing and martyrologies, and all of this is being shared across the empire, right? Mm-hmm. No other religion is doing that in the ancient world. It is only Christianity. It's unique to Christianity. Mm-hmm. So the tangibleness, the connectiveness of the early church is a shocker if you're first coming to it.
Yeah. And I think that the question of the bishop also ties to the cult, like the cult of the church. I always come back to the cult. It's something that it preoccupies my thinking completely. And I'll just confess that, maybe even to a fault. I probably have people out there who are Protestants who listen to us who just can't stand me because I keep bringing it up. But Jesus is the high priest of a cult that he established with his apostles, who then delivered that cult to the early Christians, who then perpetuated it and built upon it, as St. Paul said that they would, right? Protestant Christianity, one of the great signifiers that they implemented a new cult, a 16th century cult, is removing bishops. Priests. Because for the early church, it's yes, exactly. Like Cyprian calls him the high priest. You remove the priests. So why did Christianity have priests all this time, but all of a sudden in the 16th century, you realize that, oh, wait, presbyter means old man. Taking, that's the worst etymology in the world, by the way. I mean, taking a word at its literal sense instead of the meaning that people are ascribing to it when they use it. But yeah, you supplanted Jesus's cult. Putting it in those terms is terrifying.
Yeah. Well, because it has ramifications for culture.
Yes,
and you look back, when did Christendom break down? Well, it started breaking down with the Reformation, because you broke the cult, you broke the priesthood, and when the priesthood is the lifeblood of culture, and when you break the priesthood, culture is going to follow after it, and this is where we are. What are we now? Postmodern, or
I don't know where we are. We're in no man's land, man.
But that's why we're in no man's land, because the priests were taken away.
Yeah. It's the slippery slope of once you take away the priesthood, you actually what you do is you threaten the identity of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. Because then the question is well, why can't females be priests? If priests are basically just glorified rabbis, just teachers, well, women can teach. Why not? Right? So that's why we have this controversy, right? And so then you're on the slippery slope of, well, why can't a woman be a husband and a man be a wife? Why can't, a man be a woman be a man? I really would argue that we are at the very bottom. I would say we're even in the valley that started all the way up at the top of the slope at the Protestant Reformation. That this is just where it leads because you dared to exalt yourself over the Melchizedekian high priest himself, that this is his cult and these are his priests, and you have no right to change the cult in such a dramatic fashion because it's not ours, right? So yeah, I think that's one thing that I keep coming back to with Protestantism even today, is just saying, like, they keep saying that we have the tradition of men, and yet I can't think of a single man to point to that is the originator of our tradition except the apostles and Christ himself. But their traditions, I can point to where they come from. It's the 16th century. I know that's kind of like one of those, like, back pocket, like, basic arguments, but sometimes those basic arguments, if they're throwaway at first, but if you really just take them back out of the trash can and really put them in front of their face and say, no, but think about that. You're calling this a tradition of men, but I can literally put a name to your tradition. Like, isn't that a tradition of men? Like, that's quite a change that takes place in the 16th century. Quite a transfer of the cult, right? So yeah, that's kind of where I'm currently at, and that's, I think, what the getting rid of the episcopate also signifies.
Yeah, and I can recall reading St. Francis of de Sales, writing in the Counter-Reformation to the Reformers saying, well, who gave you the authority to hang your shingle there and start that new church there? Like, where does that authority come from? And that hit me like a ton of bricks. Like, well, of course, because all down through the ages, since the beginning of the apostles, right? Of course, there was the Orthodox schism, and there have been different schisms, smaller schisms along the way, right? But there was always some claim to authority, like, oh, well, this bishop here, or this is my succession. But suddenly the Reformers just break out kind of on their own, really in full knowledge that, yeah, we're doing a new thing here. Like, Luther was breaking from that tradition, and the response is, well, who gave you that authority? Like, are we really going to? Right, and then you're right, Stephen. Is this kind of back pocket kind of? But then look, if you're a Protestant, you have to ask that question and then trace your lineage. Like, are you really so sure that Luther was right to break from this? Right, like St. Francis of Sales, that's got a good point there. And are you willing to stake your to trust that Luther was okay to break from that, knowing that there was no authority to do that? Right.
And here's the other thing it's exactly right. And here's the other thing that goes along with that. And it's kind of goes back to what Steve said too, that why does God keep blessing this church? Why does God keep because you had the Reformation. Yeah. But then the church has the Counter-Reformation and produces another dozen saints, right, out of nowhere. And then all of a sudden, Roman Catholicism is popping up all over Southeast Asia and Japan, and it just blossoms elsewhere. It's so, it's like, the question is, Luther, what did you really have to leave?
Yeah.
Because Saint Teresa of Avila didn't have to leave. Saint John of the Cross didn't have to leave. Xavier didn't have to leave. And so these great saints grow up just out of the Reformation itself. And then the church does reform itself, and then you see the fruit of that work. It's like, God keeps blessing these Roman Catholics,
right? Luther is the classic example of the cure is worse than the original problem. It's like a man has a cold, you diagnose it, and you're like, we got to amputate. It's like he had a lot of insights. Yeah, that's the saddest. That's the tragedy of Luther, is that 1517 to 1520, Luther is great. I mean, he's making a lot of good points, guys. I mean,
exactly.
Except for his preoccupations with justification specifically, but all of his saying, like, what's going on in the church, I'm with him. I'm listening to him. I'm like, yeah, the church was really bad. Like, it was really corrupt, But again, it becomes like, well, then what's the solution to that problem? If Luther, here's what I would say. If Luther came to the Catholic Church today, right? Like, where there's Catholic study Bibles in everybody's hands, There's not like these crude buying and selling of indulgences happening. All the things that really cheesed him off. I don't think he would have left the church. I really don't. I think his theology would have been affected by the fact that this stuff it's not ticking him off, right? Because just knowing Luther's personality by what I read of him, it just seems to me that what really threw him on the theological trajectory of going away from the church was his experience of its corruption.
Yeah.
That's why I'm saying that conversion experiences they're either really great or really dangerous. But there is this sense of the text, the history, and experience, and I think Luther's experience really colored his views of the texts, and then it went that way.